Hello, this is Writers at Work, a podcast for readers and writers about the joys, heartaches, challenges, and satisfaction of the creative writing process. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Joining me on this episode of Writers at Work is Susana M. Morris, author of the new Positive Obsession, The Life and Times of Octavia E. Butler. For the uninitiated, Butler, who died suddenly in 2006 at age 58, was an American science fiction and speculative fiction writer who won the Hugo, Locus, and Nebula awards for her work. In 1995, Butler became the first science fiction writer to receive a MacArthur Fellowship. An associate professor of literature, media, and communications at the Georgia Institute of Technology, Susana Morris is a Black feminist scholar and a cultural critic whose writing has appeared in Cosmo, Ebony, and Gawker, among other publications. She is the author of several works, including Close Kin and Distant Relatives, The Paradox of Respectability in Black Women's Literature. She received her Ph.D. from Emory University. In its review of Positive Obsession, the New York Times wrote, Morris creates a rounded portrait of a working writer whose unrelenting discipline was complicated by her self-doubts, her financial instability, and her obsession with the craft of writing. It's a portrayal that helps illuminate the real person behind the mythical figure of our imagination. I say it is all that and more. I found Positive Obsession to be a virtual tutorial on the writing life, filled with invaluable counsel from Susana Morris and her formidable subject on what is required to make a career writing the kind of books one wants to write, regardless of perceived obstacles. For that, I'm most grateful to Susana, and I'm glad to have a chance to tell her so. Susana M. Morris, welcome to Writers at Work.
Thank you so much.
As I said in the introduction, I found so much in your book, not the least of which were lessons from Octavia Butler on how to go about pursuing a career as an author. I know this is trite, but the title that is derived from a 1989 essay by Butler in Essence magazine is such a distillation of where we authors all begin, with a positive obsession. Do you agree?
I agree. I mean, trite but true.
When,
Trite but true.
when did you realize you had a positive obsession?
I was probably about Octavia's age. I was a young person. I grew up going to libraries all the time. My mother started bringing me to the library when I was 5 or 6. She taught me at home. I didn't start going to school with other kids until I was in the first grade. My mother taught me everything. We were, just the two of us together, and she saw that I was a voracious reader and she really encouraged that. And then I was, writing stuff down, writing my own stories, and she really encouraged that. I had teachers that encouraged that, librarians. So it was very clear to me, like I wanted to teach, I wanted to write. I have a kind of artifact from the first grade where they're asking you like all the your favorite things. What's your favorite vegetable? At the time, it was carrots, which I still enjoy. But they asked me in the first grade, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I said, I want to be a teacher and a writer.
Oh my gosh.
So here I am.
Can you remember? I remember when I was a little boy, my parents would give me those little golden books.
Hmm.
And I remember having an epiphany that they were written by somebody.
Right.
I don't know how it came to be. It wasn't because I saw the name on the cover. It couldn't have been. But it just occurred to me that somebody made up these stories, and we saw people on TV who had all sorts of different jobs. And I guess I must have thought, hey, you could do this and be very happy.
Yes.
I mean, can you remember like looking at a book and thinking like, wow, somebody wrote this?
I can. And I think the other thing is that I had the silly thing as a young person, maybe not so silly, that when I was in school and I read books where they were like, this person's an astronaut, Sally Ride, or whomever, right? and they're doing all these great things. I thought, oh, I could do these things too. There was no reason
Oh,
for me
okay.
to believe that. I didn't grow up with money or resources or anything, just my mother's fierce determination in me. And I thought, yeah, I can write books, I can win prizes. And there was just no evidence that why would I think that? So, yeah, I think there was some kind of magical thinking happening early on with me.
You show us an example of Butler's will and drive that she exhibited at age 13, and I'd like to read it. Um, she's having a conversation with her aunt, and she describes it thusly. Let me make sure I have the whole thing in front of me. She begins speaking. I want to be a writer when I grow up. Do you? My aunt asked. Well, that's nice. You'll have to get a job, too. Writing will be my job. Well, you can write anytime. It's a nice hobby, but you'll have to earn a living as a writer. Don't be silly. I mean it. Now, let me stop there. I would imagine that most of us received that lecture from some well-meaning adult in our lives. Did you?
I think because I really forwarded being a teacher first, which is a good, nice, solid job, right? And my people are from the Caribbean. My mother's Jamaican. And so that was like a nice job. I think I probably presented the writing as a vocation or a hobby, but I don't think folks really understood how serious I was about writing.
So, so
Yeah.
you were very clever at a young age.
Something like that.
Yeah. No, and it's wonderful because she continues, and her aunt says, "Honey, Negroes can't be writers." And she says, "Why not?" Well, they just can't be. Yes, they can too. So by the time you were 13, you knew black women could be writers. Yes.
I mean, I'm significantly younger than Octavia. She was born in 1947. I was born in 1980. I knew Black women could be writers, but honestly, I didn't necessarily see a lot of that in my education. I can recall the books that I read by Black women. I think I can recall all of them. One was in the maybe seventh or eighth grade, Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. That was one. I read Their Eyes Are Watching God in the 12th grade.
Mm.
That was it. So anything I was reading by Black women were things that I was finding on my own. And so Octavia Butler was one of those authors. I remember learning about Toni Morrison. My mother used to listen to talk radio in the mornings when I was getting ready. And when she had that fire in her home that destroyed many like manuscripts, that was the
Yeah,
first time I ever heard of Toni Morrison, you know.
really. Yeah.
And I was, oh, this woman won the Nobel Prize. I've never heard of her before. No one had ever mentioned her name. But there were other folks, I read Alice Walker early on because The Color Purple as a film was so popular and would be
Right.
shown all the time. And so I learned, oh, this is a book. So I went to the library and I read the book. But in my formal education, I did not get a lot of encouragement in that way.
Yeah,
No.
I sympathize with what you're saying, and I'm a little bit sad because of it. I'm closer in age to Octavia than I am to you. And I tell you that in my education, the first time I was assigned a book in school by a black writer, a black female writer, I was in college,
Mm-hmm.
and it
Mm-hmm.
was Nikki Giovanni.
Mm.
And I tell you, in all sincerity, my reaction was, "Oh, she's Italian,"
Well,
because
based on the name.
they weren't assigning black women writers.
Yeah.
I was thinking to myself, what is going on here? Because it was the same as if they would have said, here's a book by someone from Mars.
Hmm.
That's how foreign it was to our experience to be exposed to black women writers. Um, so to hear you say that it was the same during your years is so disappointing.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, and I think it's connected to, what we're seeing now with book bans and so on. So even though I graduated from high school just under 30 years ago, which is in the grand scheme of things is not that long ago,
Right.
but when I talk to my students as a college professor, oftentimes they have a similar experience to this day. So I'm talking about students who graduated from high school in 2024 or 2020 or 2014 or whatever it was,
Right. Right.
the recent past. they have similar experiences, and this is across race.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Incredible. I want to go back to the young Susana Morris, because you depict yourself in the context of telling the Octavia E. Butler story so sensitively. You infuse yourself into the story really without interruption, which is quite a skill.
Thank you.
And you tell us that you were 15 when you came upon her work. You were a
Mm-hmm.
shy, awkward, and nerdy, to use your description.
Mm-hmm.
You took two or three buses to visit a library. And on this one particular Saturday, you found her Parable of the Sower.
Mm-hmm.
You took it to your aunt's house in Jamaica, where you were spending part of the summer. Can you recall how you felt when you were reading it?
Yeah, I mean, I write about it a little bit in the introduction. My aunt lived, she's since passed away, but she lived in a small town, very small town. And she had this very large farm, and I would just be sitting out there on her veranda, on her front porch. And I didn't have much to do. My cousins already had ditched me because I was not cool at all. So they were like, bye, girl, I don't want to hang out with you. And fair enough. And my aunt she didn't have cable or satellite TV. I think that year she didn't even have a phone in her house. She was like, I don't want a phone in my house, right? You had to go to town to make phone calls. So there was a level of isolation that I had. And so that made the book even louder. So I can remember sitting on the veranda and just being completely lost. I'm in a very different world, right? I'm
Right,
in rural Jamaica reading about Pasadena in the future, right? I couldn't even imagine the 2020s. By the time I would in the 2020s, I'd be old in my 40s, right? So I couldn't even imagine, that far into the future. And so, but that level of quiet, right? I mean, there were not really street lamps that could penetrate, where my aunt was. There were lights out in the street, but she had acres before you even got to the road, right? So I'm
right.
just isolated in a particular kind of way. And that made the message of Earthseed that much louder.
Yeah. I see it as such a seminal moment for you and sometime in the future when they film the biography of Susana Morris, I envision in that it begins with that scene of you sitting by yourself, isolated on this on your aunt's house, and looking at the book, and suddenly the sky gets very light, and the beam shines down on you, and
Mhm.
that's the special moment. Um, I think I don't know if this is in your experience. Um, Sometimes writers forget how much fun it is to just read.
Mm.
That because it's a job,
Yeah.
we don't allow ourselves the luxury to just sit and enjoy reading. Can you always find time to read? Particularly you as a teacher and a writer.
Yeah, honestly, has been difficult, honestly. I think getting a PhD so young, I went right from undergrad to graduate school. And so I was like a professional reader, reading all the time.
Right.
And I remember my first job. I lived in small town Alabama. I didn't have a lot going on. But of course, there's always work. There's always grading and prep and your own writing, scholarly writing. And I just thought, I've lost the plot here.
Right.
I love reading and I'm not reading as much as I should or want to. And actually, Octavia Butler was the key to that. She'd already passed away. This was probably 2008 or 9. And I remember going to read Fledgling because I had been saving that book.
Right.
And so that actually re-inaugurated my love for reading. It took some years to really get back to it, but at my best, I read about a book a week. This past year, I have not been so good with wrapping Positive Obsession up and all the things around it. But yeah, I really try to be intentional, and I'm part of my getting back to myself now that the book is done and out in the world is reading
Right.
for fun. I'm like a promiscuous reader. I read everything, romance novels, histories, whatever. Is it interesting? Then I'll read it. And so it feels like vitamins for my brain. So I know I'm kind of off when I don't have the time or haven't made the time, rather, to get into reading. But I
Yeah.
try.
No, it's so important, and we should never forget. that because it is such a pleasure. And
Yeah.
I mean, just because we suffer so much when we're writing doesn't mean we can't have fun elsewhere. I wrote this. I love this sentence. You said, since her death, Butler's death, I've transformed my own career with her work as a North Star. Can you explain that a little bit? What you mean by having her as your North Star?
That means a few different things for me. So the story I just told about reading fledgling, I mean, she was that spark, that catalyst to reignite my love for reading for pleasure. But then I also, like most scholars, was like, I should write about this because before I became a Butler scholar, I was a Morrisonian. I wrote about Toni Morrison, and folks like that, and I still do, but I wasn't a science fiction scholar per se. And so that kind of shifted me. Um, but her Butler as my North Star is a reminder to me to have this positive obsession, right? To be unabashed
Right.
with it.
Right.
Sometimes being in the academy, it's like a corporatized version of learning. It can be, right? And despite not coming from, a lot of resources, I decided to be a professor because I love to read and write. It was not a primarily financial decision. I thought, well, anything's going to be better than what I came from, right? Like my mother was a domestic, she worked retail. So, like being a teacher, even though teachers are not paid half as much as what they need to be paid, was going to be a step up. And so then I decided to be a college professor. I'm like, okay, they make a little bit more. That's great. So I didn't get into this with a kind of careerist mindset that perhaps I could have. So, like, the whole point is because I love this. I could be a lawyer or a dentist or something that makes a lot more money. And Octavia had the brains to do whatever she wanted. There were other things that were um, hindering her in some ways, but it wasn't lack of intelligence and it certainly wasn't laziness. And so I have taken her drive to research and write no matter what's happening outside really to heart. That's one of the main things I mean about her being my North Star.
Yeah. You write that her story is one of determination matched with brilliance. Given the choice between the two, what do you think is more valuable for a writer, to be determined or to be brilliant?
To be determined. To be determined. There's brilliant people who are not writing a thing. They're not painting anything. They're not in the ceramic studio. Whatever their gift is, they're not doing it. It's not about laziness, it's about capacity, right?
Yeah.
And I tell my students this, particularly ones who want to get PhDs. The smartest, you do not have to be the smartest person in the world to get a PhD. You have to be a person who perseveres, who persists. Because there are internal battles that you're fighting, it's difficult to write, right? We love having
Right.
written, we hate having to write. So
Right.
there's that. Research is difficult. Then you have a whole world, right? You are a mother, a father, a sister, a brother, a parent, a lover, whatever, a person just experiencing life. So there are all those things that, and in addition to whatever systemic obstacles there may be, right? Systems of power and so on, that might be also influencing your experience. So you have to fight all those things to put your butt in the chair or at the easel or whatever every time you want to do it. So you can be brilliant and not create anything. And I don't mean create for other people's consumption. I mean create just because you have to. It's a burning desire that you have. So determination is the thing, is the key.
Right. That thing you just mentioned, it's either an excuse or a propulsion. You hear people say, "I don't have any time to write."
Hmm.
Well, nobody has any time to write.
No, no.
You have to carve out time to write, and
Hmm.
that is an indication of determination.
100%. I mean, Octavia writes about it in her essay, Positive Obsession, the getting up at 2 in the morning to write, the decision to not be a civil servant after she went to junior college and to work these odd jobs so she would have the capaciousness of mind to be able to do the work that she wanted to do. It did not make financial sense. The story that she tells and that I retell in my book about her aunt, that was not a malicious, like, I'm a hater and I don't think
Mm.
my niece can do this. This was, look at the world around you,
Yeah.
young girl, young lady. I'm not trying to rain on your parade, But in this world, there are obstacles, and you are a little black girl born in 1947, before even Brown versus Board of Education, right? And we know that laws and customs don't change at the same time, right? So something might be illegal, but it's still happening, right? So segregation was a de facto fact in the United States, and remains one in some ways, right? So her aunt was like, girl, get it together. You can write, that's cute, but how are you going to pay your bills? Because she doesn't necessarily have the same vision that Octavia had. And again, I'm not knocking her aunt for that. That was very a common thought, right? And makes
Right.
sense coming from where she came from, right? She was a nurse. That's a good, solid job. You're helping people. It requires a level of education. It's steady work.
You know, so she was 29 when her first novel was published,
Hmm.
and she had been building up to that publication. You know, I often say to authors that it's never too late, but it's often too soon.
Mm,
Particularly now with self-publishing, people are
sure.
rushing their work into the market. But it seemed to me that she entered the public consciousness at exactly the right time. That she was mature in her outlook and mature in her work to be introduced to a larger audience. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I don't disagree. I mean, and the thing is, she had been trying. She first gets published in her early 20s when she goes to the Clarion Workshop in Pennsylvania in 1970. So 6 years before. So she's about 23. She had been writing before that, but this is like the workshop that really catalyzes her career in terms of her thinking and her craft, her practice. But she was pounding the pavement. She was sending things out all the time for 5 years and got no's at every single turn until 1976.
Yeah.
So not only was she mature in a particular kind of way, this was hard fought. She was not like a critical darling from the beginning and having kind of like a sophomore syndrome or something like that. Like, how am I gonna top what I did before? Folks didn't necessarily believe in her, the mainstream kind of science fiction establishment, right? She had mentors like Harlan Ellison and folks like that who really thought she was a wonderful writer and gave her feedback, harsh feedback, but feedback that she found helpful. But by the time she was 29, yeah, she had already experienced all those things. So it wasn't that rejection was easy, but she understood it to be a part of being a writer,
Right.
and it wasn't going to deter her.
When you read her work as a scholar, do you detect improvement over the years? Let's say across the five Patternist novels, as an example. Um, do you detect that she's getting better in time?
I think she's trusting her voice more. I wouldn't say getting better because even Octavia on her quote unquote worst day is better than most, right?
No, that's
But
a good way to say it. Thank you for that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, but I can hear her trusting her voice more. There's a kind of tentativeness in Pattern Master, her first novel, which comes out in 1976. The other thing, though, is that she was thinking about these characters from childhood. So when she's a preteen, she's already created some of the characters that show up in the Patternist series, which is wild, right? So she's been living with them for 20 years, at that point. So I think she learns to trust herself more. She has different relationships with editors. Some are really good, some are quite fractious because there's a lot of sex and violence in her works, and so the kind of censorship of the late 1970s, early 80s was something that she really chafed against. But I can just see her coming into her voice, persistently over and over again. And it's not necessarily linear, right? Because a famous example in her canon is Survivor. Survivor is out of print. She refused to get it reprinted. She felt like the novel wasn't up to snuff and there were mistakes that she made and she wanted to correct them and other things. And so people didn't need to read the old stuff. And she was really hard on herself. So I think for her, it was really about trusting her voice. And you do see that evolve over the course of the novels.
Yeah. You know, there's a phrase that comes up repeatedly in your book. How did Octavia know?
Mm.
For example, but this is astonishing because I had not read this book before I came upon your book. In the parable of the sower, It's set in 2024,
Hmm.
and it features a candidate for president who calls himself a Christian nationalist, and his
Hmm.
slogan is "Make America Great Again."
Hmm.
When that candidate becomes president in the sequel, he
Hmm.
seeks to cleanse America of non-Christians and reshape the country into a fascist state.
Right.
So, how
Mm.
did Octavia know?
So much of Octavia's work in the 80s and 90s, she is reacting to the politics of her day. So to quote another science fiction writer, Ursula K. Le Guin, science fiction is descriptive. It's not prescriptive. It's about us, right?
Right.
So she's talking about Ronald Reagan, whose slogan for his 1980 campaign was "Let's make America great again." And our
Mhm.
current president, wanted to harken back to Reagan in particular kinds of ways. And we forget slogans, right? So even those of us who were alive to remember that first iteration, it's like, wait a minute, hold on. So Butler really detested Reagan with every fiber of her being. She was from California. He had been her governor before, and she thought the things that he represented were going to lead to a de-evolution of US American society. So she sort of did a let me game it out. It's 1993 when she publishes Parable of the Sower. She's like, let me set it about 30 years in the future. If we continue down this path, I do believe that we could have Christian nationalist government, that we could have a fascist government, that we could have these environmental disasters happening, right? So she was a pattern master herself, someone who looked at history and thought, okay, if we stay on this path, things could happen. If we divert in this way, maybe these other things could happen. Um, and so it happened. I mean, yes, but it's a
Right.
little
So,
on the nose. It is, I'll
yeah, oh,
admit, it's
for
a little on
sure.
the nose.
No,
Yeah, yeah.
I must confess to have had a little pulling back from the book when you introduced that section. I went, my God.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
what do you say to people who say, I don't like science fiction?
Well, I mean, I get it. For some people, it is hard to suspend your disbelief. And I don't like to, as a fellow writer, I don't like to be like, oh, this is bad. But there's some not so great science fiction out there that I think has colored people's experience, right? But I want folks to think about, what Octavia asks in her essay, Positive Obsession. She asks, like, what good is science fiction to Black people? But you could really say, what good is it to anybody, right?
Right,
Not to take away from the specificity of that argument, which was necessary. But basically, she's inviting us to consider, like, science fiction and fantasy as a genre does a particular thing. I would say genre fiction in general does a particular thing. There's a thing that mystery novels do that no other genre does, or similarly to romance novels or westerns. It's doing a particular thing. It exists in a particular kind of ecosystem, and there are things we can get from it, even if these genres are not considered so-called high literature. And
right,
so, in particular, science fiction, it's about us, it's about today, but we can imagine, let's just change some of the characters. Let's set it 1,000 years in the future. Let's set it 1,000,000 years in the future. Let's set it 30 years in the future. Let's reimagine the past, right? That's oftentimes what fantasy is doing, or an alternate present. Let's take a magical system instead of a scientific system. And it's just a way for us to interrogate ourselves, right?
right.
Lord of the Rings is about us too. Game of Thrones
Sure.
is about us, right?
Right,
And so I would say, what version of us are you interested in, right? And there's so many different kinds of science fiction. So like people will say, "Oh, what of Octavia's would you recommend? I don't really like science fiction." I'd say, "Well, do you want to read something very close to home? Then you can read the Parable series, which now is almost set in the past, really, and or Kindred, right? Which is a fantasy novel. It's about time travel, but there's no time machine. There's no kind of infrastructure, which sometimes is the thing that
right,
gets folks bogged down. Like, "Oh, I don't care about reading about how the fuel system and all that. If
right,
you're into hard science fiction, that's your bag. You want to read about that. But if you're not, but you just want to get that experience of these questions that the genre is inviting us to consider, then there are always options.
right.
Yeah.
You write that she was burned out by the end of the 20th century.
Hmm.
She mentioned writer's block and feeling stuck. And there was such a quote from her that hit me so powerfully. The worst of it is not feeling much of anything.
Mm-hmm.
She filled notebooks with ideas, but nothing much came of that. What do you think happened?
I think that she was tired. We have a lot of discourse around burnout today and the concept of self-care. And I do like the concept of self-care, but what we really need is community care. Octavia was doing everything herself, right? She had community, she had family and so on, but she was a single person, unmarried, without children. And those aspects can also add more work to your plate. I'm not trying to romanticize any
Right,
of
right,
that,
right.
right? But doing everything herself, fighting uphill in every way, and then also expected to produce this huge level of creative output. It's almost impossible, you
Yeah,
know?
I had the impression of a long distance runner,
Hmm.
really pushing herself really to maximum capacity and even perhaps beyond maximum capacity.
Yeah,
And just at some point, um, there's no fuel anymore,
that's right.
you know.
That's right. Yeah, and in addition to, health issues and challenges, having had so many financial difficulties for the majority of her career, or almost until her 40s, essentially. And then all of a sudden being, winning the MacArthur and being on these bestseller lists and so on. Still having the experience of the past, right? Of the
Right.
physical trauma of, she was working in laundromats, like washing clothes while still being a novelist, right? In the beginning
Right.
of her career, she was doing really hard physical labor. That stuff catches up to you.
We know she anticipated being a writer at age 80.
Yeah.
What do you think we lost when she died so young?
Oh, we lost a lot. I think that 58 is so young to pass away. Um, I think she would have so much interesting commentary about our present moment. I imagine that she would be interviewed out the wazoo, not unlike Margaret Atwood, right?
Right.
About The Handmaid's Tale, or even Stephen King about The Stand, and so on, right? I think that we will be looking to her. She was a very generous mentor, so I know that she would have been, I imagine she would have been continuing to mentor the next crop of science fiction and fantasy writers and so on. And the people who knew and loved her lost a really wonderful friend. Everyone that I spoke with that knew her, I didn't have the pleasure of ever even meeting her, right? But all the folks that I interviewed that met her, knew her, just remarked on her generosity and kindness, her wit, how funny she was, how sweet and kind. I mean, there are just so many ways in which we lost out.
Yeah. I don't think I mentioned this earlier, and I should have. Uh, I really enjoyed reading your book. Uh, I like the way you wrote it. I thought it moved very fluidly. I thought you seamlessly introduced yourself as a character and then withdrew from the story. And some as you know far better than I do, some biographies can be very clunky
Hmm.
so I asked this question with respect for your capacity as a writer. Have you ever tried to write sci-fi?
I have.
And
I mean, like most professors, there are novels in a drawer, virtual drawer. I've written all kinds of things. So I do have a short story that's in a collection called Trouble the Water, and it's more fantasy than science fiction, but it's about a killer mermaid. I'll just say that if people want to read it. And definitely have short stories and novels in the computer somewhere that I, would need to dust off. But for sure, I mean, I am a nonfiction writer who writes fiction in her spare time. I haven't really published much, but I
Okay.
think it kind of shows up. There are novelistic conventions that I'm using.
Yes, yes.
Hmm.
So in addition to your teaching, what else are you working on these days?
These days, I am mostly promoting the book, but also thinking about my next project, which is very nebulous and nascent, right? But I'm thinking about autodidacts. And Octavia is one of the reasons why I'm interested in that. I'm interested in the kind of self-taught learner. I'm also interested in how libraries show up for those folks. Like I was always captivated when I started teaching August Wilson. Like I used to teach a survey of African American lit, and I would always include fences. And when I started learning more about him, learning that he would skip high school to go read in the library because he's like, I'm not really learning what I want to learn, but I want to go read everything in the library. That's interesting to me. That's really interesting. I think also being raised by someone who, my mother has a second grade education, she had to drop out to work on farms, right? Um, and I have a PhD, but my mother is my first and best teacher, right? So she really set me up in a particular kind of way as someone who did not go to school for a long time, but can read any novel, I mean, she's very politically minded. Mary Trump comes out with a book. My mother's like, I'm reading that immediately. I'm paying attention to the news. I'm doing this. And so I was disabused really early on of the connection between intelligence and education. Like, you don't have to be an educated person to be intelligent, obviously. And there was just evidence in my home early on. So I'm interested in writers and creators who sort of come out of that tradition. So I'm really in the dreaming and reading phase of that
Mhm.
project.
Sounds wonderful. My guest on this episode of Writers at Work is Susana M. Morris, author of Positive Obsession, The Life and Times of Octavia E. Butler, and an inspiration in her own right. Susana, thank you for joining us on Writers at Work.
Thank you for having me.
Writers at Work is a production of Bliss Publications. Erin Mitchell is our producer. Music is by Joni Mitchell, performed by Keith Jarrett. For more, see writersatworkpodcast.com. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Until next time, happy reading.